The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Tiny droplets of mist clung to the thick fur of a young bear cub as he stretched his limbs, blinking sleepily at the morning sun, filtering through the dense canopy of the forest. His mother stood beside him, her dark eyes watchful, her body a tower of strength and warmth. This was Little Paw's first season outside the safety of the den. Born in the heart of winter, he had spent the early months curled against his mother's warmth, his tiny body pressed close to hers as she protected him from the cold. But now spring had arrived, and with it came the lessons of survival, lessons he had to master if he was to one day walk these woods alone. His mother, known among the other bears as Willow, was a seasoned survivor. She had lost two cubs in the past, a sorrow she carried in the depths of her heart. This made her more cautious, more determined to teach Little Paw everything he needed to know. "Come, my son," she rumbled gently, nudging him forward with her snout. "The world will not wait for you to be ready. You must learn." Little Paw stumbled forward, his paws still unsteady on the uneven ground. The grass tickled his nose and he sneezed, shaking his head. Everything was new to him. The rustling leaves, the distant chatter of birds, the rushing river that sang its endless song. His first lesson was fishing. Willow led him to the riverbank, where the water rushed over smooth stones, cold and clear. She stepped into the shallows effortlessly, her sharp claws digging into the riverbed for balance. Little Paw hesitated. The water looked strange, and he had never felt it beyond the few drops that sometimes dripped from the cave ceiling. "Do not fear it," Willow said. "The river is a giver of life. Watch." With a swift movement, she plunged her paw into the water and flicked upward. A silver fish flew through the air, glistening in the sunlight before landing with a thud on the shore. Little Paw gasped in awe. He wanted to do the same. He stepped into the water hesitantly, but the river was swift, pulling at his legs. He yelped as he stumbled, his face dipping into the water. When he emerged, he shook himself, blinking rapidly. His mother chuckled softly. Again. For hours, Little Paw tried. He swiped at the water, pounced at shadows beneath the surface, and even tried biting at the swirling currents. But each time, the fish eluded him. Frustration welled in his tiny chest, and his growl was one of pure disappointment. "I can't do it," he cried. Willow gazed at him with understanding but did not offer comfort. "You will, but only if you do not give up." Little Paw huffed but did not leave the water. He watched his mother again, noting the patience in her stance, the stillness of her body before she struck. He tried to mimic her, his breathing slow, his heart steady. Then, movement, a flicker of silver beneath him. He struck. Water exploded around him, and for a moment he thought he had missed again. But then, to his utter amazement, he felt something thrashing beneath his claws. A fish. A real, living fish. Joy burst within him, and he scrambled back to shore, the fish still wriggling in his grip. His mother let out a pleased rumble. "You have done well, my son." That night, Little Paw curled beside his mother, his belly full, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He had taken his first step toward independence, but the wild had many lessons still to teach. The days turned into weeks, and Little Paw's world expanded beyond the safety of the den. Every morning his mother, Willow, led him through the thick, ancient forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The air was rich with the scent of damp earth, pine, and the occasional burst of wildflowers. Together they walked beneath the towering trees, their trunks gnarled with age, their leaves whispering stories of the seasons past. Willow, always vigilant, taught Little Paw how to read the language of the wild, a language older than time itself. She would often pause, her keen eyes scanning the horizon, her nose lifting to the wind. "You must always be aware, Little Paw," she would say. "The forest speaks in many ways. Learn to listen with your senses." Her voice was soft but firm, the kind that carried the weight of wisdom earned through years of survival. Little Paw followed her teachings with eager determination. He learned to sniff the wind, his nostrils flaring with each breath. The wind carried with it the scents of the forest, earthy moss, pine needles, and the faint scent of distant animals. Some smells were comforting, while others carried a hint of danger. He could smell the faint musk of deer, the sharp tang of a predator's territory, and the rich scent of prey hidden in the underbrush. Every day brought new lessons. Willow taught him how to listen for the rustling of prey in the undergrowth, the faint crack of branches that signaled movement. He learned the rhythm of the forest, the way the wind would shift when something large was nearby, or the eerie quiet that fell before a storm. His mother showed him how to recognize the scent trails left by other animals, sometimes a fresh scent of a rabbit or squirrel, and other times the darker, more unsettling scent of larger creatures like wolves or rival bears. But the wild was not just about learning, it was about surviving. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Willow led Little Paw to the river. The water ran cold and fast, the current strong from the spring melt. Little Paw loved the river. It was a place of beauty, a place where he could dip his paws into the cool water and listen to the rush of the current as it tumbled over rocks. The river was a lifeline to the creatures of the forest, a source of water, fish, and life. But it was also a place where dangers could lurk, where the current could sweep an unwary animal away. Willow stopped suddenly, her body rigid with tension. Her ears twitched and she lifted her nose to the wind. For a moment, Little Paw did not understand, his young mind struggling to grasp the seriousness of the situation. Willow's gaze sharpened as her body tensed like a coiled spring. "Hide," she commanded in a hushed tone. Little Paw's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard his mother sound so serious before. Without thinking, he darted behind a fallen log, pressing his small body against the damp wood. The earth beneath him was cool and soft, but the sense of danger that hung in the air made his fur bristle with unease. He barely dared to breathe as he peeked around the log, watching his mother stand tall and still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. Then from the shadows of the trees, a dark shape emerged. It was a bear, a male much larger than Willow. His fur was matted with mud, and his eyes burned with a cold, predatory hunger. A rogue. Little Paw had heard his mother mention them before. Male bears who roamed alone, driven by hunger and the need to fight for territory. They were dangerous creatures, known to challenge other bears, sometimes even killing cubs to assert dominance. The rogue moved with a confidence that made Little Paw's fur stand on end, his massive paws sinking into the earth with each heavy step. "This is my land now, Willow." "You should leave," the rogue growled, his voice deep and menacing, vibrating through the air like a distant thunderstorm. Willow did not flinch. Her eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening with defiance. "I will leave when my cub is strong enough," she replied, her voice calm but unwavering. Little Paw's heart raced. Was this bear going to hurt them? He wanted to run, to flee from the danger that seemed to loom over them like a dark cloud. But his mother had always taught him that fear was a weakness. A wise bear, she had said, did not let fear control them. Instead, they used it to stay alert, to be aware of their surroundings. The rogue took another step forward, his heavy form imposing. "Move, or I'll make you," he threatened, his voice a low growl. Willow's response was a low, guttural growl that vibrated deep in her chest. It was a sound that resonated with power, a sound that came from the very core of her being. She was smaller than the rogue, but she was fierce, her claws sharp and ready to defend her cub. Little Paw's body trembled as he watched the two bears face off. The world seemed to slow down, the air thick with tension. His mother's muscles rippled beneath her thick fur, every movement calculated and precise. He wished with all his heart that he could help, that he could do something to protect her. But he was small, too small to make a difference. Then in the midst of the standoff, Little Paw remembered something his mother had told him during one of their lessons. A wise bear does not fight strength with strength. It fights with the land. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give him an advantage. Then he saw it, a massive rock, perched precariously on the edge of a slope above them. If he could just move it, just get it rolling down the hill, it could help. It could save them. With all his might, Little Paw scrambled up the hillside, his paws slipping on the loose dirt. His body ached with the effort, but he did not stop. He had to act. He had to be brave. The rogue had Willow pinned now, his claws raking through her fur, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl. Little Paw's heart raced as he pushed his small body against the boulder. His muscles screamed in protest, but he did not relent. With one final, desperate push, the rock shifted. It tumbled down the slope, gathering speed as it crashed through the underbrush. The rogue heard it too late. He turned his eyes wide with shock, but the boulder struck him with a deafening crash, sending him tumbling through the air. The rogue let out a strangled roar of surprise as the current of the river caught him, sweeping him away with the force of the water. Willow stood panting, her fur torn and bloody, but she was alive. The rogue was gone. Little Paw ran to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mama, I—" Willow silenced him with a nuzzle, her warm breath ruffling his fur. "You were brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And smart. You fought like a bear." Little Paw swelled with pride, his chest puffing out with the recognition. But beneath that pride, a deeper feeling bloomed, a sense of protection, of strength. He had protected his mother, just as she had always protected him. The wild had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but he had survived. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly be a bear. The wild was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of life, of challenge, and of survival. And Little Paw had proven that he was ready for it. Summer had slipped away like a warm, fleeting dream. The days stretched lazily beneath the unhurried sun, each one dipping into a golden haze before giving way to cool, tranquil nights. The nights were filled with soft winds that whispered through the trees and the stars that glimmered like secrets hidden just beyond reach. Little Paw, once so small and fragile, had grown stronger with each passing day. His legs, once wobbly and unsure, were now steady and sure beneath him. His claws, sharp and glistening in the soft light, could grasp at branches and dig into the earth with ease. The forest had become a place he now knew, with the confidence of one who had claimed it as his own. But even in the midst of all this warmth, change was brewing. It arrived one evening when the wind shifted, bringing with it a sharpness that tingled the fur on Little Paw's back. He had never felt it before, this cold edge that seemed to hold the world in its grasp. Willow, his mother, was the first to notice. Her nose twitched and her eyes narrowed, as if the air itself had spoken to her. She sniffed the breeze, drawing it deep into her lungs, as though tasting the coming change. "It is time," she said softly, her voice a gentle murmur in the quiet evening. Little Paw, who had been playfully darting through the underbrush, paused and tilted his head. His small, round eyes looked up at his mother in confusion. "Time for what?" he asked, his voice high and curious. Willow's gaze softened and her lips parted in a knowing smile. "Time for winter," she said simply, the weight of the words sinking into the spaces between them. Winter. The very word felt foreign to Little Paw. He had been born at the cusp of it, his first breaths drawn in a world blanketed with snow. But that had been within the warmth and safety of the den, surrounded by the comfort of his mother's presence. The world outside, with its icy winds and harsh beauty, was something he had never truly known. His paws shuffled nervously against the cold earth beneath them as they began their journey up into the mountains. Each step seemed to carry them further from the comfort of summer, and the air around them grew colder with every stride. The once clear rivers that had glistened like silver ribbons under the sun now moved slower, their surfaces becoming crusted with ice at the edges. The trees, tall and proud just days ago, now stood bare, their branches reaching up like dark fingers toward the sky. The vibrant sea of green and gold leaves that had once carpeted the forest floor had turned to a dull brown, crushed beneath the weight of the changing season. It was during this time that Little Paw noticed the first signs of the scarcity that would come to define this new world. The food that had been so abundant during the warmer months was now harder to find. The berries that had once dotted the landscape like colorful jewels were gone, and the riverbanks that had teemed with fish now seemed unnervingly empty. The familiar rustling of small creatures in the underbrush was replaced with an eerie silence. The woods, which had always been alive with the sound of nature, now held their breath, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. One day, as they wandered through a thinning forest, Little Paw's stomach growled loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. He paused and looked up at his mother, his eyes wide with hunger. "Mama, I'm hungry," he admitted, his voice tinged with a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. Willow, ever calm and composed, glanced down at him with a knowing look, her golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Then find food," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of challenge. Little Paw flattened his ears, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "But there is no food," he replied, his voice small and unsure. Willow stopped walking and sat down, curling her tail around her paws. She looked at her son with an expression that was both patient and wise, as though she had seen this moment coming long before he had. "What do you see?" she asked, her voice soft yet insistent. Little Paw glanced around the barren landscape. The snow-dusted trees seemed to stand in judgment, and the ground beneath his paws was hard and unforgiving. His eyes scanned the landscape, but all he saw were empty branches and the ever-growing expanse of white. He frowned and shook his head. "Nothing," he said quietly. Willow nodded slowly, as though this answer was exactly what she had expected. "Then look again," she said, her voice gentle, yet filled with the strength of someone who had learned the art of patience over many winters. Little Paw let out a soft sigh, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He didn't want to look again. He wanted to eat, to feel his hunger disappear, to find something that would satisfy the ache in his stomach. But he trusted his mother, and so he obeyed. He lifted his head and scanned the world once more, this time with more care, more focus. And then, movement. Small, quick, darting. A flash of brown against the white snow. His heart leapt in his chest as his eyes narrowed with excitement. A squirrel. He had never hunted anything but fish before, and even then, the river had always been a help. But now there was no river. There was only the cold, silent forest, and the promise of food. He crouched down, lowering himself to the ground, his body tense with anticipation. He remembered what his mother had taught him about hunting, how to move with the wind, how to be silent, how to remain unseen. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and then he began to move. Step by step, he crept forward, his paws barely making a sound against the frozen earth. The squirrel, busy digging at the base of a tree, remained unaware of the predator moving closer. Little Paw's breath quickened as he closed the distance, his muscles coiled and ready to spring. Then, he pounced. The squirrel squeaked in alarm, its tiny body flailing as it scrambled up the tree with desperate speed. Little Paw's claws scraped the bark, just missing the target. He had failed. The squirrel was already out of reach, darting up into the safety of the branches above. A frustrated growl escaped his throat, and his ears flattened in disappointment. He had been so close. He had almost succeeded. Willow's voice cut through his frustration, soft yet filled with pride. "You are learning, my son," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. "But I failed," Little Paw protested, his voice heavy with the sting of defeat. Willow's golden eyes softened with understanding. She moved closer and rested her head on his, a comforting presence in the cold silence. "You failed today, but failure teaches just as hunger does. Tomorrow you will be better," she said, her words settling into his heart like seeds waiting to grow. The warmth of her words filled him, and he felt a small spark of hope kindling inside him. He wasn't a failure, not yet, but he would learn, he would grow, and tomorrow he would try again. That night, as they huddled together in the den, warmth from the shared heat of their bodies, keeping the cold at bay, Little Paw dreamed of the hunt. He dreamed of chasing through the trees, of the thrill of the chase and the taste of success. And when he awoke, he was ready. The next morning, when he spotted another squirrel, he did not fail. This time he was faster, more focused, more precise. And when the squirrel fell, caught in the rhythm of his success, Little Paw felt something deeper than hunger. He felt the first taste of winter's challenge and the fierce joy of overcoming it. The days stretched longer, each one a step closer to the change that lingered on the horizon. The cold grip of winter began to loosen, slowly but surely, as if the land itself had been waiting for the moment when the earth could breathe once more. The snow, once a blanket that covered every rock and tree in a hushed, icy silence, began to shrink away, leaving behind the muddy traces of the season's shift. The rivers, swollen from the melted snow, rushed with a newfound energy, their voices louder than before as they tore through the landscape, carving paths through the frozen earth. The trees, which had stood stark and bare through the biting cold, now whispered to each other as their buds began to swell and burst open, each leaf a promise of warmer days to come. It was during these months, as the world around him woke from its long slumber, that Little Paw grew. No longer was he the small, fragile cub who had followed his mother through the dense forests and across the endless meadows. His once tiny paws, soft and clumsy, had grown larger, more powerful, with claws that could tear through the toughest bark and grip the earth with strength. His broad shoulders rippled with muscles that he had earned through months of running, climbing, and learning from his mother. His fur had thickened, glossy and dark, now reflecting the dappled sunlight that began to filter through the canopy above. The bond between him and Willow, his mother, had evolved. No longer was she the guiding figure, always ahead, setting the pace. Now they moved as equals, side by side, their footsteps in perfect harmony. In the quiet of the forest, they shared moments of peace, their world a sanctuary of shared knowledge and unspoken understanding. They had both become part of the wild, their lives interwoven with the rhythms of nature. But as the days grew warmer, a shift was in the air, a sense of change that neither could ignore. It was a morning like any other when it happened. The sun had just begun to stretch across the sky, casting golden light over the dew-covered earth. The air was still, the silence of dawn wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Willow, as always, moved with purpose. But today there was something different in her step, something heavier, more deliberate. When she paused, it was not with the easy grace of their usual stops. This time, she turned to face him, her eyes steady but filled with a depth of emotion that made Little Paw's heart race. "It is time," she said, her voice soft but unyielding, like the steady pulse of the earth beneath their feet. The words, though simple, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Little Paw's heart clenched at the sound of her voice. Time for what? His own voice, thick with confusion, betrayed the storm that was already brewing inside him. Willow took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "For you to go." The words struck him like a blow, and for a moment his world seemed to stop. His body felt heavy, as if the ground itself had drawn him down, anchoring him in place. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat choking back the words he wanted to say. But why? He couldn't understand. Everything had been perfect. They had shared so many moments, so many quiet mornings like this one, so many lessons about the ways of the world. He wasn't ready for this. He couldn't be. Willow stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, until she was close enough that Little Paw could feel the warmth radiating from her. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, her touch gentle but filled with a strength that resonated deep within him. "Because you are strong now," she whispered. "Because you have learned, and because the wild is calling you." Her words, though filled with love, struck deep in his heart. The wild was calling him, the wild that had always been his home, that had nurtured him, that had shaped him into the bear he was today. It was calling him to walk alone, to find his own place in the vast world that stretched before him. Tears burned in his eyes, but he would not let them fall. He was a bear, and bears did not cry. Not for this, not for something as inevitable as this moment. The ache in his chest, the rawness of his emotions, threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down, swallowed it, and nodded. He had to. There was no other choice. Willow stepped back, her eyes soft with pride and sorrow in equal measure. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, really seeing him as the bear he had become. "Go now, my son," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it. "Walk your own path." For a long moment, Little Paw stood still, the words sinking into him. He knew this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. He looked at his mother, this powerful, loving creature who had given him everything, her strength, her wisdom, her love. And in that moment, he realized that he was no longer just her cub. He was his own bear, ready to carve his own way through the world. He hesitated just for a moment, as if unsure how to leave behind everything he had ever known. But then, without another word, he turned away. The wind stirred around him, carrying the familiar scent of his mother, but he did not look back. He couldn't. He was no longer little Paul, the cub who had followed in his mother's footsteps. He was something more. He was a bear of the wild, and his journey had just begun. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers, but it was his to walk. With every step, he felt the weight of his mother's words settle into his bones. The wild was calling him, and he was ready to answer.